The battle occurring at Fort Hood was a massive clash of modern arms, with the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army committing its very potent 16th Tank Division, as well as the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, and supporting them and backing them to the hilt in terms of logistics was the 105th Logistical Support Brigade, all beginning on CCP regime properties purchased by their ally, China. Throughout the area between Lampasas, Texas, and Coppers Cove, and of course Fort Hood itself. These properties having been previously purchased, strategically located as close to the installation as was physically possible, with many of these giant ranch lands essentially disguised with multiple dozens of rows of greenhouses that extended 800 meters in some cases, beneath which armored vehicles were stored diligently for years with green tarp over them, with crews and maintenance personnel doing checks periodically to ensure that everything was still in running, working order. All of this was done very secretive, in a very secretive manner, as the Chinese had purchased many of America's largest ports, and of course had a very many CCP-friendly truck drivers on the payroll, either actual Chinese citizens that infiltrated America and obtained CDLs, or trucking companies which were front companies for vehicle-based and logistic-based operations, secretly driving at nighttime, always at nighttime, straight from the ports over the course of years to CCP properties deep inland, not just Chinese units and their vehicles and equipment and logistics, but also friendly allied units who were to help participate in the coalition invasion, including the Russians, among many others. The Chinese forces, for their part, had done very similar, purchasing strategically properties that were relatively close or adjacent even to I-35, a very critically important main invasion route for the external components who would be arriving in a matter of hours as they were to drive straight from the border to the middle of the country before fanning out and assisting other Trojans and reinforcing those that were deeper inland. Left to the 68th PLA Group Army and 2nd Russian Combined Arms Army and its subordinate units in the area, this installation was to be crushed at all costs, as the PLA's 68th Group Army was a reserve group army that was currently undergoing reorganization, even as it was a Trojan unit. They had created, before the invasion, the 112th Combined Arms Brigade by breaking up a few divisions and mixing the battalions into a new Combined Arms Brigade, and they were to continue this, but it was decided on that the invasion was to commence, so they invaded as a unit that was partially reorganized. And, of course, there were American units, speaking of reorganization, that had reorganized. 3rd ACR went from being the main reconnaissance armored tip of the spear of 3rd Corps to a Stryker-like unit organized on the basis of a Stryker brigade, similar to what happened to 2nd ACR as well. And now 3rd ACR no longer has any armor, but instead has Strykers, and it does have a fires brigade, an aviation brigades, or an aviation battalion still, and a fires battalion, and also now simply Stryker-based. The 1st Cav Division was still the primary armored force on the installation, with its subordinate armored combat brigade teams, which were essentially their tank and mechanized formations, that some of which were out in the training ranges training, doing interoperability training with other elements within their own division, as well as interacting on the field with other units, as they were doing smaller level training exercises throughout the training areas during the time of this invasion, mimicking real life conditions with full ammunition signed out. And the air defense assets, as this battalion marker indicates, were actually two mixed battalions within the 69th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, which was here. This was their marker as their unit was on this installation. Other units, besides the 3rd ACR and 69th and the 1st Cav, was the 36th Engineering Brigade, the 3rd Security Forces Assistance Brigade, which they were essentially a brigade of military advisors that helped allied nations to advise military forces. And there was the 504th, which was a military intelligence brigade, and the 48th Chemical Brigade, and the 404th FSB. These forces were not all deployed in the field at the time of the invasion. They were mostly still within their barracks on the main post. Only roughly a quarter of all of the American forces on the installation were actually out training at the time of the invasion, and doing so with live ammunition. This, for some of the units, would be their proverbial saving grace. As units in the absolute northernmost areas of the post around North Fort Hood, which was another quasi-built-up area of the post, not quite nearly as big as the main post, but there was a PX in that area and some other buildings. These forces here, the 49 Cav battalion, or squadron rather, would escape along with mixed units that had been patrolling the area, doing patrol training, in addition to the 2nd Squadron of 3rd ACR, a striker battalion, essentially. And the rest of the units would be methodically engaged, surrounded, and destroyed, with the top priorities within the opening hours of the invasion, especially when it came to this particular battle for this particular installation, due to its high strategic value, due to its position near I-35, and it being the largest military installation within the South Central invasion sector, it had to be thoroughly and heavily defeated. Hence the reason why an entire H-6K Heavy Strategic Bomber Squadron was assigned, and hence the reason that there would be over 1,000 tactical ballistic missiles from the Russians and Chinese, respectively, fired on this installation, in addition to just over 3,200 different cruise missiles, including those that would be fired at 2 a.m. as per the first salvos timed to go off of the various container-based hidden missile systems throughout the country, the Club Ks and YJ-18s respectively, as these were systems built by both Russia and China. The Caliber, or Club K system, which was 4 caliber cruise missiles within a container disguise, and the Chinese YJ-18C, their version of the 4 missile-based container disguise system, were placed all over the nation and already had pre-designated targets selected. ISR assets would be heavily monitoring this battle space as well, as there was a orbiting WZ-7 drone here, another WZ-7 drone here, and a WZ-8, all three being high-altitude reconnaissance drones. There was also 2 Wing Loom 2 drones as well in the area that were specifically armed drones that were to support some of the ground forces during this particular operation. As the battle was now underway, with contact actually beginning 30 minutes after 12 a.m., after the artillery salvos began and the missiles began to come in, And now the air assets were beginning to come in as well by between 40 and 45 minutes after midnight. The forces assaulting the main gate would actually play a role in supporting a highly important high-value target capture mission conducted by the Falcon Special Operations Battalion of the 68th Group Army. The PLAAF had sent a total of 15 of its helicopters, as the 68th PLA Group Army did not have its own aviation regiment or brigade, to pick up the Special Operations Forces and transport them to the headquarters building of the entire installation and of 3 Corps, and to capture the general, as obtained intelligence reports indicated that he was in the building, and it was an absolute top priority to nab him and take him alive and well as a POW. Also, subordinate commanders were to be taken if possible, but if not, they were written off by the PLA and the Russian army, respectively, during this battle. The 90th Air Defense Artillery Brigade of the Chinese consisted of various different systems of shorter to medium range, including the HQ-7B systems, which were short range, as well as HQ-11 systems, which could hit incoming rocket artillery and even in some cases mortars or shells due to its LD-3000 Gatling gun, and it also possessed missiles as well. It was a short to medium range system, with the HQ-7Bs being shorter range, as well as there being HQ-2Js, which were highly mobile, and they were medium-range, high-altitude, similar to those of the air defense assets at the McAllen battle and also at the Laredo battle. This was a reserve group army, so while it had certain older but extremely deadly, highly upgraded systems, it also possessed very new systems, especially within its 112th Combined Arms Brigade. It was actually equipped with its 2 armored battalions with Type 99A main battle tanks, which were China's most advanced tank, although the Type 96B was still a highly impressive main battle tank as well, due to the technology within it that it possessed and its fighting abilities overall, which the 17th Armored Brigade was primarily equipped with the Type 96Bs, main battle tanks. Their air defense for the 17th Armored Brigade was the tracked SP-AAA-95 vehicle systems. These also had short-range surface-to-air missiles and a quad 25mm autocannon system. They also had their own field artillery battalion within the 17th, which was a PLZ-05 self-propelled artillery piece, which fired the 155mm shells, as did the artillery forces within the 112th Combined Arms Brigade as well. The actual artillery brigade of the entire 68th PLA Group Army, the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade, was equipped with the PLL-01 155mm howitzers, possessing 2 battalions of those, as well as 2 battalions of the PLL-66 152mm howitzers, also a single battalion of single battalion of PHL-03 longer range 300mm rockets with an 80-mile range, not as long as their best A300 300mm rocket system, but it still had a long reach to it, and 2 PHL-81 truck-based 122mm rocket battalions. This artillery brigade, like others within the PLA, possessed extremely heavy firepower in the form of both howitzer and rocket artillery, and with its PHLO3 systems, it had a very long reach and punch to it. The electronic warfare being provided was by a battalion from the 208th Signals Intelligence / ELINT / EW Regiment. It was just called, though, the 208th Signals, but it possessed an electronic warfare battalion with ground capabilities like the KG-600 jamming pods, where they could jam an entire area within a certain radius, and they could pinpoint enemy radio signals and jam their equipment with electromagnetic frequencies, and they could do the same with radar, just like the KG-600 jamming pods that were equipped on certain aircraft could. These forces were just off the map, but were providing a blanket of electronic interference for the American forces and their redundant systems on the ground. Again, as it was now passing 1:30 a.m., by this time, as the helos from the PLAAF, the 15 provided, the first 5 flew into American airspace well before midnight and flew at treetop level under the radar, literally. And they flew all the way to the CCP property where the Falcon Special Operations Battalion was actually based at. They refueled, and they prepared to airlift a single platoon from one of its 6 total combat companies with its additional heavy weapons and special weapons company and headquarters company and 6 regular combat companies. It airlifted a single platoon from its first company and flew them to the headquarters building just as Chinese forces were smashing in through the main gate, while there was heavy artillery fire support going on everywhere, and the Air Defense Artillery Battalion, also equipped with SP AAA 95s, with their very potent autocannons, quad autocannons, and shorter range surface-to-air missile systems, moved into Killeen and Harker Heights methodically to guard the flanks for supplies to move into the front units, as well as to set up its positions adjacent to the east airfield of the installation, because there were helicopters at the east airfield belonging to 3rd ACR. These had to be dealt with in case they were able to take off and fully loaded. 2 combat companies from within the battalion went slightly through the city under Highway 90, a state highway that connected to I-35, under 190, 2 companies of it. Another 2 went adjacent to it. As they went, one company plowed ahead while the second one sort of cleared the streets to ensure there was no armed resistance. Finding none, they continued on, with the other last 2 combat companies rushing into Killeen proper, where the 1 armored battalion and 2 mechanized infantry battalions that had moved into the city straight from midnight from their close-by CCP property near the Falcon Special Operations Forces were beginning to punch through the main gate, with these forces establishing themselves here to guard supply lines and guard the air. While the forces punched in to the main gate, they were now, having moved from their CCP regime properties, such as established like these farms and ranches with ample supplies and logistical capabilities to support such a vast, giant operation, these forces now were plowing their way into the installation with their Type 99A main battle tanks, as well as being supported by CH-901A loitering munitions, having had been fired, such as these, having had been fired by their own headquarters battalion, which itself now moved in and set up a command post within the town of Nolanville, which itself is right here. It went in to set up a command post here to get close enough to fire these loitering munitions towards the installation. And they were joined by an artillery battalion that had moved into Nolanville as well and set up a position within the town, as well as as well as these three artillery battalions here from the 203rd, also moving into Nolanville right here. They established a sort of security presence within the entire town. The whole town was locked down essentially by these Chi-Com forces, with a tank battalion from the 17th Armored Brigade joining these forces in Nolanville as well. So this area was completely locked down for supplies to be able to get into the main assault, as, again, supply routes and logistics were critical to such operations. These forces were now punching through. Just as the air power was arriving in the form of the entire H-6K Heavy Strategic Bomber squadron that was specifically assigned to the Fort Hood battle space and area, in addition to the J-11 squadron, as well as their FH-97 fighter drone aircraft that were being tested in combat for the first time, actually doubling their numbers, although the aircraft themselves were only 12 within their specific J-11 fighter squadron. As these forces came in and the helos picked up a single platoon to transport them to do the high-value target capture at the HQ building, these forces punching in the gate would support them on the ground. This was a huge battle, so there were ample things occurring all at the same time. While up here, there were other elements, a armored battalion, air defense artillery brigade, or battalion rather, of the 17th Armored Brigade, and another armored battalion from the 17th Armored Brigade, all moving together to strike the installation and carry out a SEAD operation, as that was highly vital to this operation. So they blitzed the installation, going through these wildlands here that consisted of a lot of scrub forests type areas. This was a large wildlands area where this river went through, and they bridged the river, forded it rather. They just forded the river and went straight into the installation immediately. So by the first 30 minutes, they were already breaking into the installation. And they were about to attack the first squadron of 3rd ACR, but they were turned away because the SEAD operation had taken priority, and the Russians, now smashing their way into the installation, would deal with these units, as all these units would end up being surrounded and destroyed, while the gate operation, again, was underway. These forces smashing their way in through the gate were now attacking the gate itself, the visitor center, while others simply just plowed through the flimsy chain link fencing, while precision artillery strikes hit 2 MP MRAPs that were quickly assembled due to all the shelling that began, and as well as missile strikes, and all the MPs from the 89th MP Brigade on the installation that were already armed and on duty and out on patrols were hastily assembled to try to put together some form of counterattack, although it was bound to fail, as CH-901A loitering munitions accompanied their ground forces, in addition to ample DH-10A subsonic cruise missiles beginning to fly into the installation, having been fired at midnight, but their speed was fast enough that they could reach the installation fairly quick. Down here, there's a mechanized infantry company from one of these battalions here, punching their way through the gate, while these 5 Mi-171s carrying the Special Operations Platoon from the Falcon Spec Ops are flying above them while precision artillery strikes hit. The AI systems, as AI was a critical part of warfare now, especially for the coalition, and China had the world's most advanced AI, as they lead the world in AI, quite literally, their AI systems were guiding every move, as artillery, aircraft flights, even helo flights, and ground troops were all tracked to the literal inch of where they stood in order to prevent friendly fire incidents or accidents, as well as orchestrate the forces perfectly so that enemies were hit by multiple different systems sometimes, all coordinated down to the last detail. As the visitor center was being surrounded, a squad from this armor personnel carrier, this Type 89A, raced out the back to clear the visitor center, as there were sometimes MPs in the visitor center, and they raced in there and cleared it. And after they cleared it, they would re-enter their vehicles and continue on into the installation, as the arrow indicates. These troops here running in a line formation following a wedge formation, and these two conducting a rolling shield maneuver on the side of their vehicles to protect them from any potential debris or, in a rare case, shrapnel, but they were at a safe enough distance, as well as to protect them from any potential fire from the gates, as they were peering around their vehicles, firing into the gates, as well as the heavy machine guns, the W-85 12.7 millimeter machine guns firing into them as well. So the gates and the gate guards had been totally eliminated by this point, as had been the MPs that were struck by precision artillery strikes called in upon them as they pulled their AMRAPs out and sat in that position long enough to be targeted and destroyed. The fence had been obliterated, as had been a few of the buildings near the gate, by precision artillery. As these helos and armored vehicles rushed over and through the gates and into the installations, the gate, again, was just an ordinary road going past some guard shacks, and the fencing was flimsy chain-link fencing. The installation was extremely easy to penetrate on all sides of it, as various armor, mechanized infantry, anti-tank forces, combat engineers, and others stormed the installation, not the least of which being this Special Forces platoon flying in to conduct their operation at the actual 3-Corps headquarters building, which is shaped like a tri-pointed star, in other words. As these two companies within just this area, with others taking other streets on the main post, as again, the main post was huge. I mean, it was a very long installation from east to west. And from north to south, it was a bit thinner, but all the main motor pools were by the inner training areas, and they were all lined up for each and every unit. And the H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft would have a field day with that. And the troops that had not signed out their weapons, many were even partying in the barracks when the first artillery shells and missiles crashed, with Chinese troops and Russian troops coming in, finding empty beer bottles and beer cans and wine bottles and liquor bottles all over the place, having had been abandoned by troops as the mechanized forces rolled past these barracks buildings. As one of these H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft came in, it began to completely level administrative areas, destroying the in-processing area called the Copeland Center. I mean, they munitioned this whole line of administrative buildings and support buildings. And as that was going on, troops had been running for dear life, and even cruise missiles were flying ahead of this H-6K strategic bomber aircraft going in for their target. And this CH-901A loitering munition was coming down on this group that was running out. This was armed with an HE warhead. They were running out of this building for dear life, and this red arrow indicates that they were gotten by the heavy strategic bomber and the loitering munition hitting at approximately the same time. These troops were trying to run away, but as they're surrounded by red circles, that means they were eliminated by shrapnel and dangerous debris flying out from this path of this massive load of conventional ordnance being dropped in a straight line. These forces trying to pull a wedge formation of MPs, as there were MPs guarding this area, as that was about the only defensive posture besides having troops that were actually armed in the field doing real-life training with real ammunition and real weapons. They had MPs, at least, that were armed and trying to fight back at this time, but they were being defeated on the smallest tactical level by the mechanized infantry troops of one of the two mechanized infantry battalions that had smashed its way through the fencing and the main gate, along with armor rushing into other areas to engage other forces. As the ISR assets allowed the Sino-Russian coalition forces to know exactly which forces were where and doing what and at what time. and they could get a bead on them and have artillery called in upon them as they moved in for the final proverbial KILL, the kill. These were very powerful forces all hitting this installation at once, and most of the installation was not prepared for this onslaught, as again, only about a quarter of the available troops on the installation were even training or even somewhat ready for a situation like this. Under ordinary circumstances, none of them would have been ready, as all of them would have been in the barracks or had to sign out their weapons, and as this invasion began, troops that were trying to scurry to the arms rooms either found their arms rooms locked with the armorer not there, as some of the armorers lived off post and had to be called in to unlock the armory to give everybody their weapons to sign them out. Whole units were unarmed as this invasion kicked off, which was a massive benefit to the Sino-Russian coalition forces, but it was a massive setup for failure on the American side of things, because they didn't always walk around armed, and they only did so when they were training, or if there was a Redcon status raised to a very high level, like had been the case at Fort Bliss during the opening hours of the invasion, as most of their units had made it and signed out their weapons and equipment. Fort Hood was a different story. It was further inland. They didn't think they could be touched that easily because of how deep inland they were. But they were wrong, as Trojan shock armies had built up around the installation for the day that they were to rush it, with full strength. Armored fists, heavy airstrikes, heavy missile strikes, loitering munitions, special forces. The proverbial works, if you will. As this armored company moved into position, it had one of its platoons fan out to guard its headquarters platoon's vehicles of this particular mechanized infantry company here. As this mechanized infantry company was now turned on this road with its headquarters elements following behind it, as it was leaving this area to go and raid another part of the installation, while this specific company here stayed in position to assist in the assault, this platoon being part of this company as well. There were infantry fighting vehicles in the form of ZBD-04As, which were also very potent, very advanced. They had laser and IR scrambling, and they had two HJ-08 anti-tank missile pods. They had a 30mm autocannon and a 100mm main gun, as well as a 7.62 by 54mm coax machine gun. They were very powerful infantry fighting vehicles and could annihilate infantry, as that was their job description. The armor personnel carriers, the Type 89As, were a step up from the older Type 63s, but they had a turret gunner with a 12.7mm heavy machine gun, occasionally even a 14.5, which was even somewhat classified as an air defense machine gun due to its extremely large round. It's also very potent anti-materiel capabilities. The special forces being flown in by their 5 PLAAF Mi-171 transport helos were dropped off on the roof of the 3-Corps headquarters building, where the 3-Corps commander was within. As troops on the ground from this particular company, from one of the 2 armored battalions now smashing their way in through the main gate area, with this other company moving off the map, these forces dismounted their vehicles and fanned out as this squad stacked on this wall and broke into the building on the first floor. They smashed their way in. As these two formed a rolling T formation to watch up at the windows as they both rolled for the main entrance. They ran to the main entrance. They bolted for it. This was a shock force. I mean, like, these guys were coming in fast and hard. I mean, they were coming in really, really strong. These guys advanced from outside of they dismounted their armor personnel carrier and advanced to this wall, and they threw a grappling hook up to the second floor, before tossing grenades up there to clear the room to make sure nobody was going to mess with the hook or fire down at them. And they blew the room that they threw the grappling hook into, and they all began to climb into the building. These forces of these special forces troops of this one single platoon that was airlifted in, that landed on the roof, they began to repel and smash into the third floor windows. They repelled off the roof and they smashed into the third floor windows, and they methodically cleared, as these arrows show, they repel and smash their way in. They methodically went through, as these troops cleared the first floor, these troops that stacked here and broke their way in the first floor, these troops that threw a grappling hook on the second, they coordinated everything via radio headsets, as they had a long-range radio per platoon and they had short-range radio headsets that each and every soldier possessed in order to communicate where exactly they were at as far as during a raid or operation. This helped extremely well when it came to coordinating squad-level assaults, as every squad member could communicate within a short range of one another, whereas the platoon sergeant actually had the long-range radio, which could communicate with other units in the area that were larger, as well as a short-range headset. These forces now, as they methodically cleared the 3-corps building, they found the 3-corps 3-star lieutenant general. They found him cowering in his office, trying to hide under his desk, and they yanked him out, and they shuffled him out the door as these helos flew back to pick up the special operations troops with the other 10 helos that were now just beginning to arrive in the area, to send them to their new operation, which was an air assault operation on the East Post Airfield, where the attack and utility helos were for the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. As these forces moved up to cover these guys that were clearing the building, they were taking fire from these MPs, but with their small arms, including their light machine guns and their QBZ-95 rifles, lit them up. And they fired some of their tube-launched 35mm grenades launched from beneath a rifle barrel in a tube. They fired them at this group here and eliminated them. And then as they went around the corner, they fired an RPG at this LMTV truck, as well as small arms at the MPs that were around it. And they did the same over here. As RPGs in the form of the Type 69 Chinese RPG were so extremely mass-produced decades, these could be handed out to nearly every soldier, and they were liberally handed out. This MRAP was already destroyed by fire from the ZBD-04 main gun, as well as autocannon fire simultaneously, blasting this MRAP into smoking ruins. These troops were wiped out as they charged into the area, trying to counter-attack against these troops that were dismounted. But the vehicles were supporting them as well, firing machine gun fire through the gaps to assist them as they bounded forward. They bounded first, then they bounded, and then they held their position to watch this area as they held their position to watch this area. And then they went around the corner and handled these forces here, while simultaneously, this rolling shield formation, which was actually being fired at by some of the MPs that were in this building running out, there were a few of them that had arms, and they were firing at this group right here, but they fired back along with this vehicle and this vehicle. They lit all these guys up. And again, the bomber had already flown over by this point by the time they reached here, so it also helped in eliminating most of the troops in this particular area, as well as many on the other side, because it was a huge area getting basically carpet munitioned. So as they captured the 3-star general, the post commander and the commander of 3 Corps, he was escorted and placed into the back of the armored personnel carrier belonging to a platoon sergeant within this particular armored company, and they were to hold him until the proper headquarters assets could take custody of him, as again, this was a very high value figure and he needed to be handled somewhat delicately. So he had to be passed on to a headquarters unit, but for now he was in the safety of the armored personnel carrier in order to stay safe from all the combat that was going on. But as the combat would die out, he would be transferred to the battalion headquarters, where he would be processed as an enemy prisoner of war before being transferred further up. As this was going on, DH-10A cruise missiles were flying all over the installation by this point, as well as tactical ballistic missiles in the form of the Russian Iskanders and Chinese different DF classes of tactical ballistic missiles and their cruise missiles, and more would join as the supersonic, although not hypersonic, but the supersonic cruise missiles would be fired at 2 a.m. in their first salvos from the container-based Caliber Club Ks and the YJ-18C Chinese container-disguised cruise missile systems. This battle would get more and more intense, as even though not all of the soldiers were armed and out training, there was still a little bit of fighting to be done on the main post, while the main fighting would be occurring in the training ranges and would actually last for hours, although the major fighting would wind up in only 4, which would truly be a feat of arms, as the forces attacking were a mighty force, highly technologically advanced, strong in numbers, strong in armor, strong in air power, and strong in artillery. And artillery was still the king of battle, as it was called, as shells and rockets rained on the installation, causing many to scatter for whatever cover they could find. As by the time this battle would end, Fort Hood would be a pockmarked moonscape of an installation. There were loitering munitions everywhere, such as the Chinese CH-901As that were set on artificial intelligence targeting modes so that they could autonomously target different groupings of troops or vehicles. These were equipped with HE warheads, so either or could be targeted efficiently. And the Russians, of course, had their Lancet 3, which also had autonomous targeting capabilities. So Lancet 3 had come a long way from its original form. The Russians, like the Chinese, were very technologically advanced by this point and had many of the same capabilities as the Chinese in terms of hypersonic weapons, in terms of their electronic warfare capabilities, which, like the Chinese, were simply overwhelming. And also, like the Chinese, the Russians were very tank and artillery heavy, and also had excellent aircraft like the Chinese. Russia and China were indeed like twin horns gouging through the middle of America. Although the Chinese obviously contributed the lion's share to this invasion because they had the largest armed forces or forces under arms on the face of the earth, when including all of their millions of paramilitary troops that were all combat grade and trained, in addition to their massive ready reserve forces, as well as their active duty forces. China's forces were simply mammoth, and whether they had allies or not, if they didn't, they would have been the only nation that could pull something like this off by themselves. But with their allies, it just made everything go that much easier, as Russia made a large contribution in sea and in the air especially. Although China had the world's biggest, most advanced navy, Russia definitely had plenty of vessels to contribute, as well as aircraft. Although they didn't have the size of ground forces, their ground forces were still very well equipped for the mission and fought very well, as they had some very good combat experience The Chinese had some combat experience as well, but they also had outstanding training. As in warfare, it's not always about combat experience, it's about how well you're trained, because when a new soldier goes into combat, if he was well trained, he will perform well. Like the Wehrmacht conquering most of Europe, China was blitzing through America, including with its allies. More to come, as this is a massive battle within this hypothetical invasion documentary series. A fourth-generation warfare invasion of America consisting of Trojan shock troops, external components, and a blend of extremely high technology never before used en masse in war or used at all in some cases. Scenes like these would be common as tanks would shell and plow their way through enemy formations and areas, assisted by quadcopter recon drones scanning all around their areas in 360 degrees, full ISR dominance, as well as loitering munitions in the form of CH-901As, assisting them in destroying their targets. These Type 99As were superb fighting machines filled with the latest and greatest technologies, as was the Type 96B, but the Type 99A was truly in a class of its own. Quite possibly the world's most advanced main battle tank, just based off of its specifications and capabilities. This tank was a monster, and it proved itself in combat. Russian forces, too, would have their tanks racing through the streets and training ranges of Fort Hood, such as this T-80, decked out in ERA plating. The T-80 was also a very well-balanced main battle tank. Although a bit more complicated than its T-72 and T-90 Russian-made tank cousins, it was still a potent fighting machine. Definitely a Class A tank, as Chinese forces would storm buildings from all floors, Russian forces and Chinese forces smashing their way through the installation, covered by hordes of Lancet 3s and CH-901A loitering munition drones, and ample artillery fire hitting all throughout the installation. There was truly no escape from a force of this magnitude. American troops would be fighting in the training areas for their very lives, such as this group of soldiers here firing their M16 A4s while the Chinese fire a barrel-fired 35mm grenade and fire their QBZ-95 rifles. Wedge formations. Line formation. These guys were in a line formation, fighting in the woods and the scrub brush of Fort Hood. Fort Hood had a lot of interesting terrain features indeed, and many of these terrain features would make this quite an interesting battle indeed, as it was a installation that had a mix of semi-desert type areas, scrub brush forested areas, ample hilly terrain, even in some places butte or mesa-like terrain, lots of washed out ravines, and grassy areas as well. Fort Hood was a very interesting area, and it was a massive installation as well. Massive. If you include the part of West Fort Hood that juts south, it is a roughly 40 by 30 mile installation at its absolute longest, north to south, and widest, and is populated by a huge number of troops, much of 3 Corps being at this installation. And they would be fighting for their lives, as mentioned. As Special Operations Forces flew in and nabbed their high-value target with a perfectly executed operation with the assistance of the PLAAF and their utility helicopters lended to this massive operation. As the combat continues, the next installation in this series about the battle at this installation will cover the SEAD operation carried out by elements of the 17th PLA Armored Brigade of the 68th PLA Group Army.